So we're coming back out of the dining room, and there's some of the vases I was talking about. I don't think you can see those now. I don't know. I haven't been back for a while. But I'm going to take you into this next room and tell you the rest of the history. Yeah? Oh, maybe not. I'll tell you some of the history. What happened next, because we think that his young wife died 12 years later, so they were only married for 12 years. She was only 22, so she would have only been 34 when she died. So 22 married, 34 died. We think in childbirth. So no children. So what happened next? Well, there were 3 sisters, and we've forgotten all about them, haven't we? And the eldest sister, Jeanette, had got married. The 2 younger sisters had decided they didn't want to get married. Another reason I love the family. Most rich families would marry their daughters off as quickly as possible, but not this family. They decided that the 2 girls were given a choice, the 2 younger ones were given a choice. They could either have an income for life, or they could get married if they wanted to, so they chose income. But the eldest one had got married, and she had a son called George, after his Uncle George. And he took Shugborough over. When Thomas died second, George died first, although he was the younger brother. He had 7 estates by this time, and was absolutely loaded. He absolutely was a billionaire. And Thomas decided that he was going to put all of this money together, sell all the estates, put all the money together, and give young George, nephew George, a very large yearly income, an annuity. And it was something like, in today's money, £200,000 a year. So he could run Shugborough. Not fair, is it? Why haven't I got a relative like that? But there you go. And then for quite a few generations, young George took over, and was said to have walked into the big round room at the front there and said, "Here, not quite to my taste," because he was already very rich. His mum and dad were already very rich. But he put the money to very good use. He put the pillars at the front of the house. He had the house all reclad into one colour, so that the servants' quarters and everything, as we see it today. So Shugborough's now emerged as we see it today. He had these rooms made. So he had the dining room made into the dining room that we just looked at, from a sitting room. And this was 4 different rooms, and he had it made into one. There were rooms upstairs. And he had Queen Victoria came into this room. She was brought to Shugborough in the early 1800s, when she was only a princess, aged 13. And she loved it. And she was very wisely went round all these big country houses to meet everybody, so she knew who everybody was. No one could hoodwink her. Yeah? So she was brought into this room, as you see it now. Absolutely stunning. And so George took over. He got married. He had sons, so the title carried on. He was he inherited the titles, but there was no Earl at that time. He had inherited the title Viscount, but no Earl. This gentleman was the first Earl. Don't worry, I'm nearly finished. It's fairly straightforward from now. But I've put him up on there because he was the naughty boy. There's always one naughty boy, isn't there? Successive generations have run Shugborough, become MPs. He was the one that was responsible for the Lichfield Pact, by the way. And he was very naughty. He spent the lot. Not only did he spend all the money that he had inherited, but he got the family, or rather there was a mortgage on the whole property for £600,000. Can you imagine that? That's not in today's money, that was back then. So we're talking of the mid-1800s. And in early, I think it was 1851 or 2, something called the Great Sale was forced upon the family. because one of his debtors decided they wanted their money back. They wanted £12,000 back from him, and basically they had to have this massive sale. That's where all the busts went. That's where a lot of the other contents of Shugborough went. Over a 2-week period, the £12,000 was raised by selling items from a London house and from Shugborough Hall, which brought great shame on the family, as you can imagine. And he disappeared off to France, where A, his creditors couldn't find him if there were any more creditors, and B, to hide his head in shame, hang his head in shame. So after having this great political career, he ended his life. He came back to Shugborough shortly before he died. And his eldest son took over. So he took over in 1854. He looks a right grumpy so-and-so, doesn't he? Yeah, I always think he does anyway. But then, if you'd have inherited a £600,000 mortgage, and you would probably be grumpy, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
That's what you inherit. You inherit a large property, which, by the way, I've forgotten to tell you, has now grown to 930 acres. Yeah? So none of your 84 acres anymore. You've got the farm and you've got all the land as well. So they were self-sufficient, they would grow their own food. And I don't know why he was so grumpy, apart from the £600,000 mortgage, because he married a woman who was reputedly the most beautiful woman in England at the time. Landseer was absolutely hook, line and sinker in love with her, and was said to have gone mad for the love of Lady Harriet Hamilton. She's the one that's said to haunt Shugborough, and I could tell you some stories about that. But then wouldn't you haunt everybody, ladies, if you'd had 13 children? Because that's what she did. She had 13 children. She's the most beautiful woman in the country, so she's going to have 13 children, isn't she? Very similar to poor old Queen Victoria as well. She had 9, didn't she? And they all lived. All 13 children lived. And I don't really know what else I can tell you about her, except she designed one of the... We're getting to... I need to close, because I've talked too much already. Their eldest son, when he was younger than how he's painted here, when he was younger, he was only 25, and his father called him in. Son, I want to talk to you. And he said, I can't cope with this mortgage. I can run... He was brilliant at running the estate and having children. That's his father, by the way, I'm talking about. But I'm not so good with this mortgage. Would you take it on for me? He was only 25. But this, Thomas, their son, their eldest son, was brilliant with money. He was governor of one bank and had a job at another. So he was already well into banking. And he split the mortgage up. The first thing he did was to split the mortgage up, and through his lifetime paid it off. Isn't that brilliant? Mm-hmm. Luckily for you, I'm going to end there in a moment. The last thing I'm going to tell you about Thomas Francis Anson is he died in mysterious circumstances. He'd just paid the mortgage off, and he was in his 60s. It took him 40 years, so he perhaps was 65 by this time, and was sort of thinking of resting on his laurels a little bit, maybe a bit of retirement, maybe whatever, take it easy. But he was the one that used to shoot everything. You've seen all the birds, the dead birds, but in the bird boxes, and you've also seen, he didn't shoot them, he caught them. He was a keen a wildlife person, and he also shot all those stag's heads that you see in the corridor downstairs. So always out with his gun. And he went out to Shugborough, now you know where the sort of the woods are, and along by the canal there, and there's something called the Shugborough Cliffs. There's little holes in the cliffs along there. And he was going along there when he was 65. As I say, had just paid the mortgage off. And they sent a search party out for him because they couldn't find him. He didn't come home. And they found him dead with his gun. And the only thing we can think, it's still an open verdict on this one. They ought to get new tricks onto it, haven't they? Maybe they've solved it. But it's still an open verdict. He must have put his gun down, they think, on its wooden bit on the not the barrel, the other end.
Stop.
Thank you. And he perhaps hadn't put the safety catch on, and he must have banged it down a bit too hard. It went off straight through here and straight through here. So bullet went straight clean through. The police were called because they didn't know what had happened, but they could find no struggle, no wrongdoing, no bruising on the body, no nothing. So it was just an open verdict. What a shame. Would you like me to close off, or would you like me to tell you a ghost story? A ghost story, okay. There were lots of things I could tell you about the ghosts. And as I say, we think it may have been Harriet Hamilton who haunted. I think the most striking one for me, there are occasions where lights had switched on and off with no reason. They just put it down to dodgy switches and dodgy wiring. But I've seen lights going on and off and nobody was there. Also, they were switched on in the night sometimes, after I know I'd switched them off, and others said the same. But the one I'm going to tell you is a different one. I was on the Earls Corridor. I love the Earls Corridor, my favourite place to be. And there were some children being naughty. I could hear a lot of banging going on in the kitchen. And I thought I'd better go in there and, you know, do my job and tell them off. And I said, "Oi, pack it in you," because the mother was going to do nothing. And off they went, and I decided to just stay in there for a short while. At that moment, round the door came a couple, maybe my age group, and we had a long chat. And they went, and I thought, oh, I was just moving away from one of the surfaces, the kitchen surfaces. This is a new kitchen. I call it the new kitchen because we know the old one was very Victorian downstairs. This was the family one upstairs. And I'm not kidding you, as I stepped away from this surface, there was a book just leaning like my computer is now, on a stand, yeah, on one of those book stands, wires. And it landed on the floor behind me with a massive whack. Now, if it had just fallen, it would have just... But there was no one there to push it. How can it fall or get out of a wire cage, so to speak? Because the front of it had the wire going up like that. Yeah? So it must have been lifted and whacked onto the floor behind me. I tell you, I didn't dare turn round. For about 30 seconds at least, I stood there and I thought, what do I do? Do I stay here? You know, you freeze, don't you? And I turned around and I went, is that the best you can do? Come on, what else are you going to do? And it stopped there, but there was no way that book fell on the floor. Whether the children had upset who or whatever it was, I don't know. And one other one I'll tell you very quickly. Again on the Earls Corridor, we think that was the most haunted place, the Earls Corridor. We were closing up and I walked down the corridor with my colleague, who we always used to be in pairs closing up, and we walked past Patrick's dressing room and she said to me, "Did you hear that?" I said, "Yes, I did." And I didn't know I could run, but I ran. We both did. We both ran. We heard very loud whispering and there was no one in the building. We were the only two upstairs. And I know she wasn't doing it, and it was more than one person. We were just walking along the corridor quietly, and all we could hear was whispering like this. Really, it was really loud, and more than one voice. How weird is that? There you go. I'm going to end it now, ladies and gentlemen, because it's been an hour and 10 minutes, and I promised you an hour. I always do that. Talk too much. But I wouldn't be any good at this, would I, if I didn't talk it out?
Thank you very much. Does anybody have questions? They're burning to ask. I mean, has everybody been to Shugborough? I guess probably yes, and you're members of the National Trust, and we go over there to have tea quite often, and it's sort of, yeah. So
Do you feel it's a good thing that the Trust is taking?
It's good and bad. There are good sides to it and bad sides to it. The good side is that they are preserving and conserving. They've put a massive, great big new roof onto the farm, and I don't think the County Council would ever have got round to doing that, and it needed doing. But it wasn't a good... I've heard people say the heart's gone out of Shugborough, because there's no one there now like me that can... You can't ask... The young people, I'm sure they're lovely, and they're volunteers, and they'll take you round, they'll guide you, you know, give you a guided tour, which is what I used to do. But I've heard stories from other people that you ask them a question and they don't know the answer. You know, they're given the script and they don't know the answer. They don't read like we were told to.
it's a bit National Trustified, isn't it?
Yeah, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah,
But
sure.
Are any of the families still
no.
there at all?
Now, when I did the Patrick Litchfield talk, I think I ended that one with saying he had a 99-year lease. That was, I don't know how many years it would have gone on for, about 50 more years. And he died in 2005. His son took the lease over till 2010 when Patrick died. But his son gave the lease up, signed it away, and that was that. No more family. So
Did one of them move to another house?
that was Thomas Jr., Patrick's son. Excuse me. He moved to Devon. He must have inherited a lot of money. He would have inherited a lot from Patrick and a lot from his grandfather, who was the Duke of Westminster. He used to work with his grandfather, the Duke of Westminster, in London. So it would have taken a few years to sort those estates out. Patrick had, although he didn't own Shugborough, he still had other property and other money elsewhere. And of course he was the most famous photographer probably in the world at that time. So he wasn't short of a bob or two. And the money would have been split equally amongst his children. But Thomas was left a lot of money by his grandfather. So he bought a 2,000-acre estate in Devon.
As you do.
As you do.
What was the unusual name of Patrick's partner?
Oh, Annunziata Aspen.
Oh, no,
That was his part to the Duke of Westminster's daughter. And they got divorced 12 years later. So the boy did good, didn't he, after giving his house to the National Trust. He didn't do badly for himself. But he... I was talking about this the other night. It's funny. I find it quite funny. And I shouldn't do, really. If you were a widow, you could get married again. If you were a divorcee amongst those circle of people, and if you were Catholic, you couldn't get married again if you were a divorcee. So when he got together with Annunziata, she was a lovely, lovely person. She kept coming back and she kept bringing things for us to put into the apartments. She was a lovely woman. I never met her, but my colleagues did, and they were all, "Oh, Jude, you should have been here yesterday." Annunziata came. You know, they loved her. And he asked her to marry him, and she said no, because I can't. And he said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because I'm a divorcee. I'm not allowed to get married." So they lived together. That's the bit I find quite funny. She was religious, so they lived together. But there you go. That leaves you scratching your head, doesn't it? But there you go.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.